This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.
Got it. Okay, welcome everybody to the March 16th meeting of the School Reuse Committee. I'll just give you an update tonight. Jeff and I are going to give a little update to City Council as far as what this committee does, what our purpose is, because I know there's been a lot of discussion of, how we relate to the property subcommittee. And so before any misconceptions were generated or run with, we wanted to sort of just introduce ourselves, say who's on the committee, what our role is, how we interact with the City Council, and just sort of an introductory chance just to introduce ourselves. So that will be all it will be tonight. That'll happen sometime meeting starts at 6 tonight. So somewhere on the schedule that will happen. I will have to duck out early because the day job scheduled a conflicting meeting at 1, so I may have to lose. But so in the meantime, I'll hand it over to Jeff, and you can run with the rest of the meeting, Jeff.
Thank you, Joe. So we're going to do, we have an agenda. It's Valley CDC is here to kind of go over some of the work that they've been helping the city with. So we'll start with that. And then Emily had prepared kind of the first full draft of the RFP. So that was sent out. And so we should definitely talk through that. And then as time allows, we did start a frequently asked question document. So we should just at least touch base on that. We could potentially get a brief update from Mass Development. There's a little bit of work that has started, a schedule for the school committee, and then City Council. And so we would hope to just at least touch base on that too. So, and then we would do public speak time at the end if anyone's here who has questions or comments. So maybe with that, Jessica, are you prepared to talk a little bit? I may do co-host, so if you wanted to share your screen or not, but if you want to take it away, you have the floor, maybe like 20 minutes or so. I don't know if you need that much time, but
it's really up to how much the committee wants to ask us questions. I can kind of run through what we did really quickly and then just leave it open to committee. First of all, nice to see y'all. It's been a while, so nice to see you. I'm here with Laura Baker. She's the director of real estate here at Valley CDC. Just to give you just a little bit of background, we are a nonprofit organization. We're based in Northampton. We have a variety of programs, but one of our divisions here is real estate development. We focus primarily on affordable housing. We work in Easthampton, Northampton, Amherst, and Hadley. Those are our service areas. And so right now, currently, we have a CPA grant with the city of Easthampton as a pre-development feasibility analysis, with the idea that we are actively looking for a site to build affordable housing in Easthampton. And we have committed to look at 2 parcels that are owned by the city, 1 parcel that has been identified for housing in the housing production plan, and then another private site. So we have been working at this since about August of last year, compiling lists. And as part of this project, Jeff asked if we'd be willing to do a fit test, essentially, to look at the existing schools that are going to be surplus and try to get an understanding of how many units might be able to fit in there if you're an affordable housing developer coming in. So I put a memo together, and I believe it's been sent to the entire committee, but I'd like to just quickly run through it if that would be okay with everybody, just to get an understanding of, how we think about this, our assumptions, criteria that we need to be cognizant of as we're trying to scope out a project, so that you have an understanding when you put your RFP out, kind of what where our assumptions and our restrictions are. So let me just make this bigger. So just to understand some of the assumptions that we used in our analysis. So first of all, we are assuming that 100% of the projects would be residential and the majority would be affordable units, deed restricted affordable units. So that's our first assumption in building this out. Second is that we are under the assumption that the 40R zoning that we know is currently under amendment at the city and at the state level, the zoning would be changed to allow under the 40R residential units on the ground floor. Currently, the 40R zoning prohibits that, which would then prohibit the number of units that would be able to be built within these buildings. So we know that's in the works, but we're making the assumption that that zoning will pass. Thirdly, we're making the assumption that we are going to be utilizing public subsidies through DHCD. That is who we apply for federal and state low income tax credits and soft debt. And that the tax credits would be a major source of the revenue for the project. We're also working under the assumption that we are designing this for family housing production. So that means variety in the size of the units, 3 bedrooms, 2 bedroom, 1 bedroom. It's not going to be a senior housing development of just all 1 bedrooms or all studio apartments. So that was, again, the assumption is that we would have a mix of units in these buildings. And then because of that, there are certain design criteria that DHCD puts forth in what's called their qualified allocation plan, the QAP, which is available on the state website if you ever have the desire to read a 300-page document about affordable housing subsidies, if you're having a sleepless night and need help. And then there's also the notice of funding availability, which adds some additional design criterion as well. So based on those 2 documents, we are scoping out our unit count based on that the project has to have a minimum of 20 units in order to be eligible for LIHTC, the low income housing tax credit program. And that it needs to have a minimum of 12 units to be eligible for other soft debt subsidies. And if you ever dug into the QAP, you'd see that there's certain cap amounts for each of those programs. And so we try to structure our deals to have the right unit count kind of match up with how we can best utilize those funding programs. DHCD also requires that 1 bedrooms are not less than 600 square feet, 2 bedrooms are not less than 800 square feet, and 3 bedrooms are not less than 950 square feet. So in utilizing the documents that were provided by the city, that's the square footage that we were kind of scoping out for the units. And the other requirement that DHCD has is that for family housing production, at least 65% of the units must be over 2 bedrooms, with 10% of the units over 3 bedrooms. So, these are, when we're, again, looking at existing square footage, we're trying to make the square footage work for these requirements. And I do have this, pretty big disclaimer here. So how we did this is we took the floor plans that were available in the Maple Street School application to the state for the school funding. We took those base plans and basically using the scale, just tried to scope out based on the square footage, how many units we could fit in there based on these design criteria. So these have not been reviewed by an architect. They have not been reviewed by a structural engineer. They have not been reviewed by an MEP, a mechanical, electrical, plumber, engineer, anybody who's looking at heating and cooling systems. So what we often see is, we do these kind of sketch concepts, and then when we give them to our professionals, they're going to cut back a couple of units because we try to, get as many units as we can, and they're telling us, no, you need more space for the mechanicals, or you need more space for plumbing or whatever. So I would say, as a disclaimer, if anything, these numbers that we've kind of sketched out, and they are very conceptual and very sketchy in sort of the drawing, not in the, is that the unit count may actually go down, that this may be a higher number than what could actually be built in there once you start to take into consideration all those other things. So does anybody have any questions about those assumptions? No? All good? Okay. So I'm just going to walk through kind of what we came up with for each school based on the conversation that we had with Jeff about what we should be looking at in terms of programmatically. So we're looking at the center school, we're looking at a complete gut rehab of the existing building. We'd be having to add an elevator. Valley, in our projects, we have on-site laundry, community room, offices. We like to have all those amenities as part of it. We'd be looking at the existing playground to remain. This is what we were able to scope out is 17 units on the first, second, and basement floors. I will note that the window units in the basement, because of the shape and the size of the windows in the basement, it may not be feasible to put units down there. That's something that would have to be determined by the architects looking at building codes. DHCD has specific codes for that as well. You need to make sure that you have egress from those locations, that somebody can escape if there's a fire. So it, you know, that could definitely change. So the basement floors, because of the window size, may not be able to work. I also want to note that, as I noted before, to be eligible for LIHTC, you need to have 20 units. We only can see about 17 units here. So this project would not be able to be eligible for LIHTC funding, but could potentially be eligible for soft debt. So based on the parcel size and the number of units, this would be a density of about 14.45 units per acre. And I am going to note that this is not meeting the 20 units per acre that would be required under the 40R zoning. So, you know, if somebody was to utilize 40R, they may need to put an addition on, they may need to look at unit configuration a little bit differently in order to get those 20 units to meet the zoning. And I know that parking is often something that's discussed a lot with development downtown and what's needed. And I may kick it to Laura to talk a little bit more about what is typical in our projects and what we see is needed for parking. We don't see that we need, based on the tenants that we support, to have a 1-to-1 ratio of unit to parking, which is what is currently sketched out in the 40R zoning. So the parking ratio based on the existing spaces and the number of units, the aerial photographs that I were looking at showed anywhere from 13 to 20 spaces that were being utilized. So the parking ratio would be 0.76 to about 1.1 based on no other additional build out. Center School, we did, the first one that we did was the existing building and then plus doing a building addition because we wanted to try to hit the 20 units to be eligible for the LIHTC. So this is a gut rehab of the existing building plus a new construction of a 4-story, 18,000 square foot building, on-site laundry, community room, office, elevator, renovated playground, and this has 31 off-street parking spaces, is what I was able to sketch out. So I made an error when I was doing my sketching out. It doesn't currently meet the DHCD unit mix requirements, but could probably easily be fixed with the new building addition to make that work. The density at this level would be 47.7 acres per unit and a parking ratio of 0.68 spaces, which is pretty consistent with most of Valley's properties in terms of our parking. Maple Street School, using the existing building only, gut rehab, again, building of an elevator, laundry, community room, office, keeping the existing 32 off-street parking spaces in the playground. Our vision would be to add some green in that space. There's a lot of pavement and we think it's really amenable to some landscaping and some nice trees to soften it and also to bring some more greenery into that part of the city. Looking at about 27 units at the first and second floors with no units in the basement due to the window limitation size. With the parcel size, the density would be 18.2 units. Again, not hitting that 20 that's under the 40R zoning. Another 3 units would need to be added in order to meet the requirement. With the existing parking ratio and the units, we're looking at about 1.2 spaces per unit. And then we were asked to look at Pepin keeping the gym as a community space versus trying to build out the gym as a community space. So the first with keeping the gym, it's a partial gut rehab. Building would include upgrades to the existing elevator, on-site laundry and office. All of the gym and the gym accessory spaces like the locker rooms and the bathrooms and et cetera would remain because that would be part of the function for the gym. There's potential solar because of the existing flat roofs and there'd be existing off-street parking on the separate parcel. There's 28 spaces there that I could count. So based on that, I can see about 31 units being placed in Pepin School, putting the density at about 44 units per acre and at 0.9 spaces per unit. And then the build out would be removing the gym, building the whole thing out, 42 units on the first, second, and basement floors. Concept could be that the units in the gym would be presumed to be a loft style to deal with those high ceilings. It'd be about 60 units per acre at a 0.66 spaces per unit. So that is what we were asked to do for sort of unit counts. And then the last page of the memo was really just a draft development pro forma, just so that the committee could understand, you know, the sources and uses and how much it would actually take. Now, I will tell you that these numbers were run at the end of December. Since then, construction pricing has completely changed. We saw a 25% increase in lumber in the month of January alone. So it's really hard to predict construction numbers for right now in our industry. It's just changing so much. There's just a shortage of supply. So based on this includes the build out. So this is with the addition. So this is the existing school with the addition, 42 units. All of them would be available to 60% at median income or less. That would make it qualify for the tax credit program. And the build out would be around $450,000 per unit, even at with all of the subsidies that are being provided. So just to walk you through the sources and the uses. So the uses of the funding would be assuming that the acquisition cost is $1 from the city, that it's essentially a donation from the city. Construction hard costs, again, pricing at an end of January pricing was around 14.7 million. Soft costs, which is the architects, the engineers, environmental, were required because it's tax credit. There's some other soft costs like accountants and stuff like that that may not be necessary for a market rate private developer. So those soft costs were about 11% of the budget. And then there's funding that would be placed in reserves for operating reserves, developer overhead and fee is about 12% of the budget. So it's about a $19 million project at this scale. But the majority of the sources of revenue coming from federal LIHTC and state LIHTC, you can see that's about 78% of the total. The rest of the funding would be coming from DHCD soft debt, which is these three, the Affordable Housing Stabilization Fund, and the FCF, the Facilities Consolidation Fund. We'd be looking for an ask from the Easthampton CPA. Right now it's budgeted at around 360,000. And then the project would take on a permanent debt. It would carry a mortgage for 30 years of $1 million that we would be paying off over time with money from that we'd be getting through operations. So this is really just kind of a quick and dirty of, you know, when we're kind of looking at a project, this is our first step, is to see what the unit count would be, kind of get a sense of what the cost would be, and trying to find that kind of sweet spot of the number of units from operations that are needed to carry the building forward, the number of units in order to maximize the subsidies that we can, and what meets the zoning and the permitting requirements in a community. So those are sort of the three things that we're kind of grappling with when we're looking at unit counts. So I can stop the share, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about our process and you know, how we work through this, and anything you'd like to know about affordable housing development.
I'll add one quick note, which is that the 20 unit minimum for the tax credit program could be a scattered site project. And so it's more complex and the legal costs go up, but you can put, and I know this is relevant to your discussion, 2 sites together to kind of aggregate that minimum.
I have a question. I'm wondering if we could subdivide the property to increase the units per acre. I know there's not much property to deal with, but maybe we can subdivide into a playground and that will increase the units and make it eligible. Is that something that can be done?
You mean eligible under the permitting, not necessarily the tax credit financing?
Yeah, the 440R, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could, if you reduce the parcel size, then the calculation changes and the units change. Yep.
Can I latch onto that just for a second? So I think there's good news within the 40R zoning. There are waiver opportunities. The way that I understood it is the only thing you can't waive is providing 20% affordable units. So that's like a hard and fast, but it says anything else can be waived. So you could also have a discussion that this is the existing site and this is the best we could do per that density calculation. And that's probably I mean, I'm not going to say anything's easy, but that might be like an easy lift in terms of a waiver. Just that's one option. And in terms of 40R, I did want to say I appreciate what Jessica's showing about this projected zoning change. We're in the process. I did want to report real quick that we did get an initial favorable review of the zoning amendment, and they had no issues with taking out that ground floor prohibition. We need to finish the hearing process that we're in and go to city council to get it approved. But at DHCD's initial review, and I specifically asked them, they didn't really have a concern with that. So that's just promising in that regard. So that's great.
I have a quick question, a couple things. Did you ever look at any of these with the concept of a tear down and putting in new construction? And then is this parking strictly private, or could it be shared with public?
So we did not look at a tear down because it was kind of my assumption that there isn't a lot of appetite for a tear down for the schools, and that it was more leaning towards trying to save the buildings. We could certainly do that, but I think, that gives us a lot more flexibility. We can design a building that fits our needs, that fits our design requirements, that allows for MEP, can have solar.
Yeah, more efficient. There's a lot of good things about it. Yeah.
More efficient, more, better design. So I think with the ability to do a tear down, I think that opens up for us a lot more opportunity in terms of getting the units that we need, meeting the zoning, getting the right unit count. It's tricky to sort of fit into these funky buildings. I will say that Pepin, with all the grade changes, the half stories between the two buildings, the gym, the wide corridors, it's tricky. It's really tricky to make these things work. And I feel like sketching out Maple and Center were a lot simpler because they're a lot more square. Pepin is just a funky building. And so it's tricky to make it work. And, the flip side is that we can then go to DHCD and say, hey, we did the best that we could. We're getting as close enough as we can to this unit mix. Can we get a waiver? Because we're working within these existing framework. So I think, it would make our lives a whole lot easier if we're able to do the tear down, but, we like to try to be as environmentally conscious as well. And if there's something that's got good bones, we want to look at that as well. So.
And parking?
Parking, the shared parking. So, I think that's a question for the community, quite honestly, because we feel, and Laura, maybe you should chime in now about parking, because you're pretty passionate when it comes to the parking requirements and affordable housing developments and what functions and what makes sense for us. I think your calculations are 0.57 spaces per unit.
So we would encourage the city to look flexibly at the required parking. It's so case specific in terms of location, proximity to bus line, walkability, and it also really flexes with the income level of the population and the size of the apartments. The smaller your apartments, the fewer cars, the lower your income standards, the fewer cars. So we pretty much know at a certain income point, people can't afford a car. So we know they're not going to have one. So that's not factored into normal zoning. So I would really look, again, it sounded like there was possibility through the variance, but, we often start just looking at one space per unit, but we have buildings that are much less than that, where we have empty spaces. And so again, it really is a case-by-case look at the composition of, because not all units are equal when it comes to what it's going to generate for cars. So if it were desirable to have shared parking, it certainly is something to be thought about, whether, you want to have enough for your tenants. Is there on-street parking? Just a bunch of different factors to look at if that's one of your goals.
Yeah, I think Michael had a question, so.
Yes, hi, I'm Michael Budnick, a resident, and I'll tell you more about myself when it's public comment, but I just had a quick question. Is the gym space that you were talking about, is that the same as the auditorium theater space that has the kitchen off to the side, or is that a different space?
So the way that I read the plans is that the sort of half floor, basement, first floor, second floor, that's all gym. And then above that is the cafeteria. So the cafeteria is actually built out with units, and the gym would remain with the double story, with the idea of it being kind of like a loft style apartment.
Okay, and I'll reserve the rest for public comment.
Thank you. That's great. And then I saw Councilor Riley had a question too. Had your hand up.
Yeah, so I have two questions, and they both kind of come at the same issue that I'm hoping we can avoid with the community, and that's just that I think any mitigation that we can have towards community opposition is desirable. So two questions. First, is the LIHTC credit essential for your development, in that, would you be able to manage the soft debt if you went for the smaller structure? Because I'm trying to think in terms of, that, the community might have that NIMBY approach of not wanting an additional 4-story structure going up in that location. And then the second question is, realistically, how much could Valley CDC purchase the properties from the city? Because I know that the community has strong opposition to essentially donating them. And I'm just trying to think, getting ahead of the situation of, what the voters might actually be upset about once this plan comes forward. Thank you.
So I would say in terms of acquisition costs, we really don't want to have to spend money on acquisition if we can avoid it. It is so expensive to do construction right now. To just give you an understanding of cost, because that's really where, as you saw in the development budget, 70% of the cost is in construction. I'd say probably a year and a half ago, Laura, please correct me if I'm wrong, but typically it was $200 a square foot is what we would estimate for construction costs up until COVID and the pandemic and supply chain issues and whatnot. Our current project that we're about to break ground on in Amherst, our final budget numbers are what, Laura, $425
or 50 a square foot.
450 a square foot. So in a year and a half, the market has gone crazy. And so, we are looking for funding gaps with projects that are already in the pipeline. And where a community really can step in and help an affordable housing project is having a really smooth permitting process and putting some money on the line, whether that's CPA money or whether it's through a donation of a building.
Yeah, I mean, if you sell the building to a developer, it doesn't have to be Valley. They're just going to need that much more money to develop, and they'll come to you and ask for it. I think towns and cities overestimate the actual market value, cash value of their old buildings. It's not as easy as you think to sell them. I've watched a number of communities, Hatfield's a great example, try to sell their old schools year after year after year and not have any buyers, or have people be disappointed at the nature of the reuse of the property. And it's just, I do think there's a little bit of a disconnect in how much people think they're worth.
Yeah.
If you want to preserve them. If you're willing to see them be demolished, that's a different story, because the land probably has more value than the building.
Yeah.
So that's a key fork in the road for a community looking at any old building, old municipal building, is, are you willing to see it torn down? If you're not, then the donation is almost like the carrot to get someone to work with your old building instead of taking it down and building new, which is going to be more efficient.
So Jeff and Emily, is that something that we can include in our frequently asked questions document? Because I feel like that's going to come up, and that explanation, I think, would be helpful for the public to know.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Then turn to Ben, is that we did mark it out as an FAQ, and I think we have a draft of that, but I think the responses obviously are going to be really important. But it's going to be this discussion about trade-offs. I think, like, at a community level, we're going to be talking about trade-offs, and I think Laura and Jess both said it, is like to preserve the buildings, which we think it would be a really good community benefit. And on one hand, the trade-off is going to be releasing the property for $1 or significantly under the market value. So I saw Ben raise his hand first, and then Pat.
So hold on, I want to go back to Councilor Riley's second part of the question, which had to do about unit count and the LIHTC. So I think Laura had to drop off because she's got a 1 o'clock meeting. So we've just lost her. But anyway, so in terms of the soft debt, a lot of Valley's projects in the past have been soft debt only projects. Their operations run at a very thin margin. It's really hard to manage a small unit building if you still have an elevator, if you still have common spaces, if you still have all of those common costs. When you can diffuse that over a larger number of units, the operation of the building becomes better. So, so that would be my one comment. Yes, it could be done. I would also encourage you to go back and look at your community plans that talk about density in the downtown. I mean, it's over and over and over again about building up density. You need housing units. We all need housing units. Where are you going to put housing units? It's better to have it be in a downtown than somewhere else. So again, I think it's a little bit of that community conversation and trade-off. Is it better to have a large unit development out on the outskirts of town, or would you rather have it right in the center of town where you have goods, services, walkability, PVTA, that sort of thing? So, again, I think that's part of the community conversation. For us, the sweet spot with a LIHTC deal is anywhere between 40 and 60 units. That's where we can maximize our subsidies before we get to the point where sometimes you get over that 60 margin and then you're kind of capped out at what you can get from the state. So you're not kind of offsetting your construction costs, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then I want to move, but just, I think Laura said it before she jumped off, which was that the idea of a scattered site. Our previous discussions were, and it comes out in the draft RFP that, we kind of want Center and Pepin to go together. And that in theory, that could be a scattered site to put the two together and achieve the number. I just wanted to mention that. I think I got handed over the responsibility of chairing the meeting. I'm going to do Ben, Pat, and then we have a member of the public here, Michael Budnick, and he has to speak before Valley jumps off. So Michael, if I can get to you third, I'm okay with taking a public comment, not at the end, but if you just wait till after the other two talk, that'd be great. All right, so Ben.
Yeah, I just thinking about the capital stack and the timing. Jessica, what would you think, just so everybody's kind of aware of how long that might take, for a project like this, how long do you think it would take to get the financing in place?
So I would say for any affordable housing project, from project conception to construction completion and lease up, can be anywhere between 3 and 5 years. That's typically how long it takes. Now, the funding at the state level is incredibly competitive, very competitive. The more shovel ready and the more that you're hitting kind of the state high priority needs, the higher chance of you being funded. So for instance, the state right now is really focused on individuals that are houseless and looking for units for the creation of individuals to get them off the street. So that is something where they're putting a lot of money. There's a lot of ARPA money that's coming down the pike right now. So there's opportunities that are open, but that funding has to be allocated by 2024. So there's, this push to sort of get these units in place. It takes us, our step-by-step process is, once we have site control, because that really is the key. You need to have site control before you can apply for funding. So once site control is in place, then you can apply for funding. You may be funded the first round. You may be competing the second round. There's a round every year. So it really depends on when that money is granted or awarded. And then it takes a couple months, 6 months to get to a closing. And then we've got probably a 15 to 18 month construction period. And then we're into the lease up. So it takes a long time. There's a lot of parties that, as you mentioned, the capital stack, Ben, there's a lot of people who have their finger in this pie in terms of money. It's equity investors. The states, the tax credits are sold to insurance companies, to banks. They're the ones who are putting the money up front. So they're invested for 15 years into this project. There's often a lot of attorneys on these calls and closing. It's like, $1,000 every time because there's like 5 different attorneys representing 5 different subsidies in order to make these things work. So yeah, it takes a while.
That's a
Not
good
for the
question, Ben.
faint-hearted.
Yeah, we're not faint-hearted around here. Pat, do you want to go?
Yeah, you may have created another question for me, but so do you think an organization like Valley CDC would, one of the kind of thoughts I've had as we've gone through this process is, do we do this as one RFP for one location versus 2 versus 3? And I know we kind of talked about that, and I know that it's kind of designed with Center Pepin really being one and Maple being another. Do you think that there, it would be, there's any disadvantage to making it 2 separate locations versus 1? Does that change Valley CDC's like thought process on, nah, we don't really want to do this if we're only getting one of these parcels versus all 3 of them? So that's the first question.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the organization. I mean, I don't want to speak because Valley isn't going to be the only one that's going to be responding to this RFP, right? So
right.
There's going to be a bunch of different entities, and it's going to depend on their capacity, what they already have in the pipeline, what they've already got commitments to, how many staff they have. So, that's part of the decision-making process is what do we have the capacity to handle, knowing what we already have kind of stacked up.
Okay.
And I can't speak to what other development teams are like right now.
I thought you were going to just write us a check, Jen, and or Jessica, we were going to be done. No.
So, I mean, the other part too, in addition to that is, we're mission-based. There's a need for housing. There is no doubt. So, if we can secure sites and get housing built, we absolutely want to do that.
Okay.
But I think what a municipality needs to understand is, there's a limit to how many applications we can put in per year. We can only put in 2 per year.
Mm-hmm.
We can't, because there's just such a high demand that we are limited. So again, depending on what's already in your pipeline, where are you going to put that funding application in? Those are all strategic decisions that any organization is going to make. But I'd say, if the greedy real estate side would be like, yeah, we want all those sites because we want to build housing. Yeah, we need to get people into houses. The other side is, all right, we'd have to be strategic about our capacity and what other things that we have to, what we've got in place. So I think it's a decision for any organization moving forward and what they're able to handle. But I think it's important for you to know that an organization can only put in 2 one-stop applications in any given year. So depending on what else they've got queued up might limit them.
And this might be a silly question, but I'm going to ask.
No such thing, Pat. There's never a silly question.
You don't know that. We'll see. So one of the things that was mentioned was that there's a 3 to 5 year span for the funding, for finding the funding for this. So who owns the property still during that 3 to 5 years? Who's still responsible for making sure the snow's shoveled and heat's on, or whatever the case may be?
So again, that's going to be a decision for the municipality. I think if I was wearing a municipal hat, I'd want to have some level of control. I don't think the city would want to put itself in a position where it sells a building and then the developer falls through and the project doesn't happen, right? So there's like this kind of like sweet spot, I think, that needs to be sort of determined on based on timeline and based on what the organization thinks that they have or the developer thinks they have in place. When can they realistically take over the building? Again, site control is huge. We can't do anything without site control. So there would need to be, an option agreement, purchase and sale. There'd have to be something in place. We wouldn't have to necessarily own the building, but there would need to be some documentation that will allow us to move forward with funding requests. So site control is huge. It could be a negotiated shared thing too.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Those are good questions, Pat. That's a good one. I mean, I think that's going to be a cost that someone will carry. And that's, that's something that we need to talk about as this group in terms of the RFP too. Great. So I will, I don't have any issue with having Mr. Budnick ask his question, and then we'll kind of continue on from there and see where we go.
Hi there. Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Michael Budnick. I am an Easthampton resident within sight of Bank ESB downtown and have been for a number of years. And I am also I run Mad Science and Art Ventures for Kids, which is an educational organization, longtime entrepreneur, as well as marketer and finance guy. I am also, as many people know, very active in local community and regional theater. I sit on the board of Exit 7 Players at Ludlow, and I'm also its treasurer and currently, shameless plug, directing Curious Incident of the Dog of the Nighttime, an awesome play that's up this weekend. The reason I am on here is because I think that we have a tremendous opportunity and we have a model in Ludlow. I don't know if you know but the building in Ludlow is owned by the Ludlow Housing Authority. And when this high school vacated that whole complex in 1984, the Housing Authority took it over, put in affordable housing and a senior center, and gave a long-term lease to Exit 7 for that theater, which has been turned into one of the greatest community theaters in the area. Now, Easthampton has suffered for a number of years from not having community theater. And now there are so many more people that are oriented towards theater and performing arts in Easthampton, and so many patrons as well. I represent a group of people that we are loosely calling ourselves the Easthampton Community Theater Development Committee, who really would like to bring community theater back to Easthampton. I have toured the auditorium at Pepin, and I think that it would be perfect not only to establish community theater, but also the adjacent classrooms for establishing my long-term goal as a long-term educator who teaches enrichment programs, to bring a youth drama academy as well to the heart of Easthampton. The drama studio in Springfield is thriving. Exit 7 has a small youth program as well that does very, very well, enrichment program. And that space there, the auditorium, and the what I would call rehearsal space in the back of it, with very little modification, would be perfect for community theater. Now, just to anticipate a question, some people might be asking, what about city space? Well, it's wonderful that we're going to be putting a black box into city space, but a community theater cannot compete with the type of commercial activities that are going to go on at city space, and cannot pay the rates that are anticipated at that type of thing. Not only and community theater needs a place to rehearse consistently, a place to build sets that can stay there. It is an entity that really suffers when it has a rented or part-time location. Now, the final thing I say,
Michael,
the last thing, I just have one more statement. Okay, very quick. Last thing I'm going to say is that there is a regional small professional theater that would jump at the chance to also be a resident theater in this thing. So it's not just community theater, it's also small regional theater as well. So that's all I had to say, and I'm hoping that we could possibly cooperate with the CDC to bring something in there. And by the way, the cooperation with Ludlow also includes use of the theater and the lobby space in the theater by the senior center and the residents for events when they need it.
Great. Yep. No, we just have a tight agenda, and we took you in the middle. So I would encourage
a presentation similar to what CDC has just done as well. That's at a future time, or we.
I don't think this group is necessary. I don't think we need that at this group. I would encourage you to prepare a letter and have it ready. We are, we're going to talk about the schedule. We are going to submit the RFP to council, and I think that's going to be the next stage in which your input would be received. I think that there are some ways to respond to that, but I think we need to move on, because we have a couple of things. I know people are going to drop off at 1:30, but I would encourage you to formulate your sort of your program into a letter and have it ready. We're hoping to submit this to City Council in May. But we did a strategic planning workshop all through 2020, and all of these types of uses were certainly considered. So the idea is not new. I think funding it, funding the creation or maintenance of the space, and accessibility to that, I think, is going to be critical for future discussions of that.
Exit 7 is entirely self-funded through ticket sales.
Right, except, yes. So we can continue to talk offline. I would encourage you to begin preparing a letter that would be suitable for City Council. But I do appreciate you coming. This is great. So not to be too abrupt or abrasive, but I am going to shift back to the agenda, because I do want to make sure we cover a few things. We started to touch on the FAQ, and so what I'd set up was a Google Doc and sent it to everybody. I don't know if we need to go into that right now, unless someone wants to jump in with questions. But I think for the next meeting, that would be a really intense homework assignment that I would like everyone to try to look at that. Brad's question about sort of releasing the property for under market rate was on there, and I think that's going to be a talking point. I think we have covered a lot of the other talking points. So I guess my question to the committee at this point is, does anyone have a question that they didn't see on there yet or want to jump in on, or should we kind of move on with the agenda? Hearing nothing, I'm going to move on with the agenda. Ben is here, Ben Murphy from Mass Development. And Ben, I don't know if I can put you on the spot and just maybe have you give a quick update on the project that we have going with you guys, and I can fill in any gaps too after you spot.
I can have a really quick update. We did have our official kickoff meeting. Was it this week or was it last week? Recently, yeah. And so VHB is moving forward on kind of doing the basically fact checking all the, it's just going and seeing what the existing conditions are in the roads, the systems. They'll be doing a camera in the sewer system to better understand that. And we expect that we'll get a report. I'm shooting for mid-May. So that's kind of when we expect that. Also, Crowley is on board to do the appraisals. And Jeff, have you been in touch with? I haven't heard anything on that recently, so I'm not sure if anything's moved forward. That should be certainly done before mid-May also.
Yeah, and yes, so the appraisal company toured the buildings last Thursday, I believe. So that was kind of their initiation of that, creating the appraisal. So I would imagine they still have probably a couple weeks until they actually have the appraisal. But we covered this once, but it's worth kind of reiterating that the appraisal is necessary in the event that the city wants to let the properties go for less than the market value. So it's like a required step. So that was why we worked with Mass Development as that's one of the key things that we definitely wanted the assistance from Mass Development to pay for that. So that's underway. Ben, the other thing that VHB was going to do is sort of one conceptual design plan for each of the properties. And we just provided some information to them, kind of some ideas, but I think that's where we'll get this sense of kind of picking up where Valley CDC is leaving off with kind of the fit test for the number of units in the building. What I kind of hope to see from the VHB is, can they show parking spaces, the necessary parking for tenants? And I think when Chair McCoy kind of asked the question about public parking, would there be any spaces left on either of the properties to carve off any number of public parking spaces? And so, and then they will leave the school sites and look at some of the surrounding streets, and just to start to get a sense of, are there potential areas in the future that we could formalize or create on-street parking, enhance some sidewalks, or there's a lot of crosswalks in the vicinity that haven't been upgraded in ever to meet sort of ADA requirements. And so they will come up with kind of this schematic design, and our goal is to insert that in as an appendix of the RFP, with some caveats that it's only one version, but it's just going towards this information that shows that these things are feasible. So like the fit tests with the number of units shows that this is possible, and it has to be reviewed carefully by others, but it is possible. And then same thing with parking and other site features. So, I mean, that's, we have a tremendous opportunity to be working with Mass Development on they are hiring those consultants to assist us. So it's really a nice relationship that we have.
And I think with the conceptual plans, thinking about whether or not public parking and public playground space is a priority for the city, including those in the concepts will be, I think, helpful for a developer coming in to see, kind of see that that's an important thing. It might not be required, but it show that it's important.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Great. So the only other thing is really a schedule for, well, no, other than going through the RFP, the only other quick thing is kind of the schedule. And I did want to just quick preview that what we're trying to map out is potentially trying to go to the school committee early April. And, you know, their vote is really going to be to determine that the school properties are sort of no longer needed for school purposes. And, you know, the thing that we want to map out with them is that there would be a date, and for conversation purposes, the date might be like August. So the school will finish, they have a purge plan to remove all the things from the school. And then, you know, that would be like this projected date. So, you know, the city attorney is telling us that we could have the school committee potentially vote on this in April with that timeline. And then what that would do is that would give us this segue to bring, you know, a report and the draft RFP to city council for them to start their process. And so we still have a little bit more mapping out to do of how that will work, but the goal generally is to see, you know, if we can have kind of the RFP in a good draft form by sometime in May and submit it to city council. And then from there, and that's what Councilor McCoy, Chair McCoy said, we will introduce it to city council and then it goes to the property subcommittee. And one of the things that, you know, this group, you know, it's really the charge of this group was to assist the property subcommittee by doing all of this legwork and coming up with a good solid draft RFP with the reasons why. And we give it to city council for them to review, consider, you know, maybe make changes, maybe not. And then that would move forward through the process. So that is a quick thumbnail of the schedule. And then I think if we have a next meeting in April, we'll really have that buttoned up for sure in terms of the timeline. So I think maybe with that, Emily, I know you gave us a long 20-something page document, but maybe there are some highlights that you would want to go over with the group, and I'll hand it over to you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jeff, and good to see all of you again. So yes, it is a long document. I think the key pieces for what I'd love to hear feedback on the entire document. But for today, I think the key piece is the requirements and the conditions. It's that evaluation criteria that we've been talking about in the past. I think the other thing that, you know, there's a lot of information in this document because the city has a lot of information to give, but, you know, if there are thoughts on how much information is in here and whether we need to have that narrowed down a little bit, that would be great. I'm just scrolling down to the evaluation criteria so I can throw it up on the screen. Here we go. So in talking with all of you, you know, I want to make sure that we're all comfortable with this, for going forward for discussion, but also that, you know, I didn't miss anything. So that's the other part of it. So we talked about affordable housing, and this is really the sort of the second crack at taking everything that we talked about and putting it into the not advantageous, advantageous, and highly advantageous blocks. So this is to the point of trying to keep the affordability level flexible enough that a developer is able to respond, especially given the changing conditions that Jessica was talking about earlier today, but also making sure that we're putting in highly advantageous, that we want a wide range of area median incomes and max that out, and that we also want a wide range of family sizes as our highly advantageous. We talked about ways of doing community connections. I'll run through these and then we can get any feedback. But in terms of community connections, again, leaving which connections we keep prioritize or flexible for the developer, but saying that, you know, the more community connections, the more ways we are able to have the people who live in the new developments interact with the neighborhood, the better. We wanted them to be responsive to the fact that these are either existing buildings or existing sites that exist within a built environment. And so the design needs to be responsive to that. And, you know, responsive is the advantageous being imaginative about how responsive it is, thinking about the architecture, thinking about the site, thinking about the community connections is highly advantageous. We talked a little bit about environmental sustainability. The city has already accepted the stretch energy code, but so for this, it's putting in whether it's advantageous that it's eligible for leader sites. In other words, it could comply, but we're not asking them to certify it, and that the higher level, the highly advantageous, is that it is committed to applying for those. And then the retention of the existing buildings on this page, we've talked a little bit about that, rather than requiring that they be retained, leaving it flexible, but at least in this iteration, giving a highly advantageous that all three are retained. We talked again a little bit earlier today about the number of sites in the proposal. So not advantageous. We don't want somebody bidding on just a single school. But you know, that Center and Pepin are treated as a single site, and that so somebody could respond for Center and Pepin in a single site, or they could include all three schools there. And again, if the wording doesn't make sense as you read it, that's the type of thing, having your fresh eyes is really important. You look at it too long and it makes sense to you. Schedule, we talked a little bit about this in terms of control, you know, and that should be maintained control. Apologies, Word apparently doesn't like the way I type things. So how long is the city maintaining actual control of the properties and paying for costs? And given the information Jessica just gave us on a timeline, we may need to shift that from 1 year to maybe longer. So something to consider. And then standard ones, experience, financial status, and interview. Financial status is a little tricky because you wouldn't anticipate that a developer that didn't know what they were doing would apply, but there's always that possibility. So you really need to put that in. And, you know, I am anticipating that you will want to interview all of the developers so that the interview is in there as a criteria, that they have a engaging and highly satisfactory interview, obviously would be highly advantageous. So I think those are the most critical components in terms of what we do or talk about today, and get feedback on. But I would love, as I said, I would love your comments on the entire document. And I don't know, Jeff, if you want them to forward comments to you and you'll forward them to me, or I think you all have my email address. I'm happy however you want to do it. That would be really helpful. And then I believe we are meeting again on April 12th. So any comments I receive, say, let me just check the calendar, in the next week and a half, I could turn around and have another version ready for discussion before April 12th. And, you know, if there's any conflicting statements, right? If I get a comment that says, I want A and somebody says, I want B, then I would just call that out for discussion at our next meeting.
Does anybody have any observations from skimming it at least? Chris, you want to go ahead?
I do. I don't know if this is the time to do it, but I would like to see some revised language about the retention of the buildings in light of the units information that we learned today. It's becoming less and less likely that keeping the buildings are in fact advantageous. I don't know what the rest of the committee feels, but that's my opinion.
I second that.
Yeah, and I think the way that we've talked about this previously, right? And I think it is in there, and maybe what Chris, what you're saying is it could be stronger or clearer, is that if we do get proposals that take the buildings down, and actually it is in there, so 15% more units, you know, plus LEED certification, plus, you know, maybe the community benefits would all need to kind of increase with that. I think it's good to go in there. I do think that I think something that Councilor Riley said earlier is, you know, we're gonna have small buckets of things that people will react to when it becomes more of like when it hits city council. And I do think that the discussion around preserving the buildings versus not, I think is going to be a pretty big one. So we might want to just think that through as we go. But I think this committee has been pretty clear that that's not as critical, but we do expect that there will be people in the community who really do think that that's important. And I think the good work that we've done so far is that we do know it can be possible to make it work, Chris. I think it may not be as many units. It may not be as many units, but it would keep the buildings. So that's that trade-off. So, Chris, I didn't mean it, and I saw Pat and Councilor Riley.
No, I was just going to say, I think I agree with Chris. I think it just is a matter of rewording how we had this, where it was kind of not advantageous to tear them down. I just think there's some, I don't know what the tweaking is, but I understand what he's saying. And I think we've already, like you said, we've already been down this path kind of. I think people they're going to be upset if you take the building down or not. That's going to happen. They're upset now that we're taking Whitebrook down and it's got to go. So that's going to come up, but it's how we address that. But I think Chris is right. I think if we just kind of tweak these as we sat in that meeting and kind of put what was advantageous and not, I think we're rethinking that on the fly here as to maybe just tweaking that verbiage there.
And
Great,
if I could just respond quickly to what Jeff said, I think that what you said about, conflicting advantageous slots, with the LEED certification, the number of units, et cetera, that's very true. And that makes a lot of sense, what you said. So yeah, that's all.
Okay, thanks. And then Councilor Riley.
Yeah, so Emily, is there going to be like a weighting system for this, like WEIGHT, in terms of, how many points are awarded for each category? Because, I could see, right, like when we're talking about whether or not we're going to tear down the buildings or keep them in place, I mean, do we want to assign less weight to that versus other things? Or, I just, when I've seen some RFPs in the past, it's, like 3 points for this or 5 points for that. And I didn't know if we were going to take that approach or, yeah, so any guidance.
Yeah, no, that's perfect to bring up at this point, because you can do exactly that. You can assign points to the not advantageous, advantageous, highly advantageous, just as you were talking about. The other thing is you can assign percentages to the categories. So one I did recently, for example, had like the interview was 10%, financial stability was 20%. So, between it gets mathematically entertaining with percentages and points, but I could work out a suggested system to weight some of these pieces more highly, especially based on the comments that you just had. So I can propose that for the next meeting.
Great, that's really good discussion. I had a couple quick comments that I just wanted to air them out so that it didn't seem like there would be a lot of edits going in, for me after the fact. But the notes that I took this morning were that under the connections piece, I believe that we can be a little bit clearer on the things that we hope to see. So I was reading through it, and the first one was kind of a little bit vague. No, I'm just saying it was a little vague. And then the second set of connections was a little bit more specific in terms of desirability of the park. And I think I will be proposing a couple amendments to I think we have a pretty clear view of what, in terms of a park or playground, at each of the sites, Center Pepin and Maple. I think that was really strongly kind of clear. And so I want to wordsmith that a little bit so that comes out more clearly. And then I think public parking, I think in both, especially Maple Street, that we should really be articulating that as something that we want to see attempt at. And then, we're kind of responding to the things that Valley CDC was providing us today. Center School, although if we retain it, we get a lower unit count, but we get a larger area where the playground is, and it's just all pavement. So, one of the trade-offs is if the building stays, that would be an area for a playground and potentially even 10 or 15 public parking spaces. So we do want to kind of push those a little bit, especially if we're talking about buildings staying, then that's going to be really critical. So I wanted to just note that I think I'll have a couple edits in that kind of space. And then in terms of being brief, in the descriptions of the properties, I appreciate Emily grabbed from, we have a recently completed Main Street Historic District inventory. I did want to say, I think we have a lot more information in the Maple Street design feasibility study. And so we might want to pull some of that in to those descriptions from there. And then the last thing is we have a more documentation that we can add into the appendices. And I think that Maple Street design feasibility should really be primary in there. Because I think certain parts of the development team that looks at this will really want to dig into that. So those were my kind of my quick, there'll be more, but those were the big ones. I just wanted to air them out so that no one's shocked when it comes in the next version.
I'm glad you mentioned the descriptions of the buildings, though, because I was going back and forth on how much information to put in. I think some of my prototype RFPs, they were like a page or maybe 2 pages of information about the buildings. Now we've got 3 buildings, so there's a lot more detail to put in because you've got 2 more buildings than these other did. But it was kind of a fine balance of how much do you want to point people to the information and how much do you want to include in the RFP itself. So I absolutely agree. If we think we need more upfront, then happy to pull from the other documents as well. So. And look forward to the comments and again, the comment on being as explicit as possible. I don't want to go too far away from the flexibility, but having heard Jessica, not just today, but also in watching the video that we were all assigned for homework, the specificity of what we can tell the developers will be really important. So I think, Jeff, your suggestion to maybe drill down a little bit more on those is really good. Look forward to seeing the detailed comment.
Yep. And then, in the chat, Laura did offer a comment on the experience level.
Mm-hmm.
So we should make note of that. It might be too narrow. Maybe there's some relevance to prior experience in affordable housing development and renovation of buildings. Specifically school buildings. So, past experience, specifically renovating school buildings may be too narrow. So I can appreciate that. I just wanted to kind of put that in out of the chat into this meeting. A couple other things, it would just be that how it fits in, but I want to air it out is, we believe, like the city believes that we want to be a partner with the developers. So in terms of the public infrastructure, we're going to have the mass development part, which shows existing conditions of the neighborhood and potentially a conceptual design. And I did want to raise it up because I think in the RFP we want to, I don't know exactly how, but we want to articulate that we will be a partner and that we, in some ways, we kind of expect to be working, for larger amounts of public dollars to support the development of these properties. And that's something I'm in the middle of these webinars for the Community One Stop for Growth. So the way that the state has restructured their grant program, and one of their examples is when you have not only a site, but you have a developer who has site control and has a budget and has a plan, and you need public infrastructure improvements to match that. And so, maybe that's a couple years down the road, but we do want to kind of be articulating that we're going to be there, and we kind of have a good track record of doing that now, and we want to keep going with that. So that wasn't really in there, and I will add that in.
Great. I think that makes a lot of sense. That will help in terms of the contributions. It's not just the buildings. It's not just whatever other direct financial contribution, but also the public infrastructure is an important component. So that'll be great.
Yep.
So again, if everybody could get me comments, any additional comments you might have, take some time to think about it, but within the next week and a half, would be really helpful. Give me enough time to turn it around so you have enough time to read it.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. And I'll put out an email requesting comments on the RFP and comments on the FAQ.
Right.
So this all could work out pretty well. So in terms of going back to the timeline briefly, we can bring something to the school committee without the RFP. So the RFP is not necessary for this to hit the school committee. and that we're targeting April 5th. And just in case they need another meeting, a second meeting to do any of this, that would be the second meeting in April. And then, and we have a meeting on April 12th. So we had talked about 2 meetings at some point, and in reality, it could be that April 12th, and then sometime after that, we might need to meet again in preparation for getting ready to submit something to City Council in, early or mid-May. And I'm thinking about the mass development piece, the report that they're expecting to come in mid-May. So, that might be our real target, to have this complete package by mid-May, and we hit the first meeting of City Council in June. And that would still really be, we would be on a good timeline still for that kind of effort. We don't know how long it'll be in City Council, but getting it there is kind of the goal. So I think maybe anyone else, Emily or anyone else, or was there anything else that we should touch on before maybe we're done? I don't want to, I'm not used to chairing a meeting, so I want to make sure that I capture anyone who has any last questions or comments. Or Pat?
Doing a great job, Jeff.
No, I'd like to thank Emily, because that was a pretty big lift, this document. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
And I appreciate that a lot. And I think, we will be getting some asks of this group. So I think not the school committee. I don't think the school committee is going to be a challenge, or I don't expect that, at least at this point. But after that, I think, attending certain meetings and being available to talk to people, I am going to just say this out loud, which is I was thinking about the way the draft pro forma got presented. There is a pretty significant potential that CPA is asked to contribute to these projects. And I was thinking, and I'm thinking out loud, that at some point between now and before we release this, so let's say between now and June, maybe a small group of us go to CPA, start a conversation, because it would be really nice for us to have introduced a little bit of this to them, possibly get a letter of support of some type, a letter of commitment, not necessarily of the funds, but the idea of contributing CPA dollars to the project. Because I don't want to necessarily put out an RFP and have someone guessing or worry that the CPA may not be behind the project. So I'm just thinking out loud. Shouldn't do that. But Jess, it looks like you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, just this is not with my CPA hat on by any means. This is with my developer hat on. I just want to be clear about that. That, when we are applying to funds to DHCD, it's critically important to show that there is a local commitment, and they will generally not entertain any applications that do not have some sort of local cash financial commitment from the local municipality. So having that local dollars in early leverages a ton of money at the end of the day. So it is an important piece of the funding puzzle.
Yeah, and so maybe even just bringing it to CPA, making sure they're aware and offering some kind of letter that they understand that there will actually be a funding request a little bit later, but just to know that it's been brought to them and there's some level of commitment to supporting it. That might be a little bit of a thing we might want to try to do in the next couple of months. So I think everyone, Mr. Budnick was our public speaker, so I don't see anyone here who would talk during public speak. So I guess, barring anything else, I think we'll maybe adjourn. Chris, were you gonna add anything or?
No.
No, okay. So the next meeting will be April 12th. And if I have my ducks in a row, we're gonna try for 12:30? Is that a decent time, at least right now, to try to project for that?
Yep.
Great.
Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. This is great. And so I will send out an email with homework, review the RFP and comments and FAQ. Any other questions or even attempts at answers, kind of helping us frame some of the ways to respond to that would be great.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Everyone, take care.
Yep, you too.
This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.